Hello, and welcome to, well, welcome to an introduction, Naval History Live, to the Indian Ocean, 1941 to 43, World War II. A lot of fun. Anyway, I'm your usual host, Dr. Alex Clark. Before anyone tells me off for recording this so late, I did record 3 previous versions of this. I didn't like them. And after tonight's brew ships, well, I don't really feel like sleeping. I've got a lot of good memories of my dad going around in my head. So I thought, if you don't mind giving me a little bit of a boon, while I was going to be up anyway, I might as well try and get this perfect, so that when it launches at 6 a.m, it has everything I want it to in it. Which is, well, an interesting quest. Because it's really quite a complicated one, and I'm going to have to be more careful in future when I'm selecting what's proposed to go to the vote, because this one I was very keen on doing. But it turns out I'd forgotten quite a bit of what ends up in the Indian Ocean, mainly because it gets subsumed into other campaigns and is treated like it's other campaigns, but actually it takes place in the Indian Ocean, and it is a massive amount of conflict. And it's understandable once you get into the factors of the Indian Ocean, but it also is to an extent sort of hidden because of all the stuff going on in the Atlantic and the Pacific. Rather like the 2 world wars, hide the stuff that happens in the interwar period. And you end up with books which have 200 pages on World War One, 350 pages, 400 pages on World War Two, and 30 pages on the 20 years in between. The Indian Ocean, because of the major battles happening in the Pacific, the battle that is the Atlantic, and the fighting going on in the Mediterranean, gets glossed over. Few key incidents get remembered, but very few really. And that's what we're going to go through. We're going to go through and discuss them. We're going to talk about them because when I was thinking about this, when I was going through and going, oh, that went there, and I remember that one there, and it's quite, A, I was surprised at how much I remembered, which was good, and B, I was then shocked by how much I didn't remember because of how much went on there. And I thought if that's the case for me, then for other people it's going to be even more fun. So, we have the speaker set up as close as it can be to me. We have me watching the little red line and seeing where it ends up. So far it hasn't gone massively high up, which should mean that you're not getting that many sparks, but you can hear me. But I am watching it carefully. I always watch it carefully. I don't like it when it goes super tinny, but it does sometimes. Hopefully it won't go that much today. Anyway. Bilge pumps. Bilge pumps is cool. Bilge pumps is carrying on, and bilge pumps, there's a link down below too. We've got episodes starting to build up, quite a collection already. We're already on to episode 7 in the stream, 10 overall. And it's just growing from strength to strength, in my opinion. We're getting better. It's me, it's Draken Fanel, it's Jamie from Armored Carriers as your base crew, as your main crew, and we're even now going to be having guests come on. As I announced in Brew Ships on Sunday, on the 19th of July, we've got Michael Clapp going to be coming out, his one in 3 weeks. The one he's coming with, we're going to record it not this week, but the next week, and it'll be coming out the week after. And we're going to be looking at amphibious warfare, the current trends in it. Michael Clapp, the 1982 Falklands commander of the Amphibious Task Group, is going to be coming on with us three to discuss the future developments of amphibious warfare. It may take, you may have to listen to us fanboying for about, or the free crew fanboying for about the first 20 minutes. I do apologize in advance. It's going to happen. Anyway, so on we go. So this is British and Dominion merchant shipping in interwar years. This is what the Royal Navy was worrying about in the interwar period. This is what the Royal Navy was thinking about in the interwar period. And it matters for several reasons. A, those are the ships which are big enough that if they get lost, that's going to cause the Royal Navy a lot of worry. These are the big ships that matter. And B, look at where that trade is going. There is a big, thick band out from the UK, through the Bay of Biscay, round Spain, through the Mediterranean, through the Suez Canal, down the Red Sea, and across India and Southeast Asia. Huge, thick band. There's also quite a healthy band going down the west coast of Africa. Now, you start off World War II, it's against the Germans. The Japanese don't join at the beginning, and the Italians don't join at the beginning. But the British are uncertain about the Italians, and so the trade starts to flow. The trade starts to move away from France. Just away from France. And B, well, how do I put this politely? B, it sort of starts to figure out where it's got to go. And when where the surface raiders are, they start having an impact. Convoys are having an impact. All these things, but the trade's still got to go and still got to get there. So this leads to the sea point. When you have Italy finally enter the war, that big thick band starts heading all the way around Africa into the Indian Ocean. It's still getting there, and actually gets thicker because there's now troops and supplies coming through for the British forces in North Africa. For the Mediterranean forces in the Eastern Med, for all the stuff which is going into British Somaliland, which gets kicked out of and then gets back into. There's all sorts of things going on there. The Indian Ocean becomes really critical. And I'm going to disappear for a second as I'm going to expand this. Try as I can't get it to do it in a smooth motion and take over the whole screen. It's always two. Well. I'll work this one out. Anyway, so what you're dealing with when you're looking at this map is you're looking at also the weak spots of Britain. You're looking at the weak spots as they're focusing on, and you're looking at the key ports they're going to depend upon. In many ways, the transatlantic trade isn't the big thing the Royal Navy has to worry about, and this is going to affect most of the campaign. When we talk about the Indian Ocean, there will be German submarines down there. There will be Italian submarines. There will be Japanese submarines in the Indian Ocean. We're going to be getting into lots of things, and in many ways, the Battle of the Atlantic and the Battle of the Indian Ocean are very, very similar. And I know I'm using "in many ways" a lot this evening. I'm not sure why, but it appears to be favourite word of this evening. Well, favourite sentence. Let's see. So here are the commands. And technically, the Indian Ocean is the East Indies Command, but part of it certainly includes the China Station and the Australian Station and part of the South Atlantic and Africa Station. It also includes the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea. Now, here is the interesting thing. There are many problems ashore when it comes to the land. I've covered quite a lot of this in my Singapore and Fall of Malaysia videos, but if you're interested in those, links should appear above here. Maybe now, maybe later. I think I do actually have it mentioned on a slide, so I'll probably save it for later, but at some point above me will appear a link to the Malaysian and Singapore videos. Now, the whole point you have is the Royal Navy seems slightly better at organising despite having a more informal command structure. Technically, stations are of course independent, and they all have their own senior officer in charge of them. Some are run by vice admirals, some by admirals. However, there is a primus inter pares in the Far East, first amongst equals, although they're not really equals. Usually the most senior admiral, either the most senior commissioned admiral by commissioning date, or most senior admiral as the others are vice admirals and I'm the only admiral on station or only proper admiral on station, there is a difference. It's the China squadron, China squadron commander. And that is often how it works. So whilst they're all technically the same rank, they do actually have what passes for naval staffs at this time, which is a fairly decent number of personnel, really. And remember, every naval staff, whilst it's officially you only have this many staff people, oh yes, this is my staff, and it's about 20 or 30 or so, is actually a rather silly thing, because we start talking about it and you get people go, but naval staffs are far smaller, or they're of comparable size to the supreme commander of Army and Air Force forces, but he's managing to generate far more. How? Well, it's quite simple. You have your official staff on the ship, on your flagship. You also have all the flagship's officers and personnel you can draw from, and your squadron's personnel you can draw from. You might have your own staff, but you also could well have a squadron engineering officer, etc., and all these for the squadron that is part of your command. Technically, they're not part of your staff. Well, it's an iffy thing whether they're part of your staff or they're part of the squadron organization, the squadron engineering officer, these things, but they can help with your organization and your prepping for it. And if you're an admiral of the China station, you have your flagship officers. You also have your yacht officers who command who are on your sloop, which is your yacht. And so you have two pools of officers. Yes, they're not endless, and a whole lot of communication specialists. So a lot of the things which you would see would be necessary in terms of a staff if you're a military organization ashore, you don't necessarily need in a staff of an admiral when he's got a flagship, or when they've got a flagship. In this period they're all guys, of course, but these days. So they can draw if they need to. Okay, I need someone to send the signals. Well, I don't need a signals team if I'm an admiral on a flagship. My flagship will have a signals personnel as part of its crew. I might have a signals officer, but the odds are I'll also be able to use the signals personnel in the ship if he's asleep or if he's incapacitated, because they're there. They're part of the ship's crew, and the ship's there to serve me as the flagship. It will look after me. My chief of staff, I might have a chief of staff. I might use the flag captain as my chief of staff. So technically, is he my senior staff officer? Is he my flag captain? Is he my second in command? There's all sorts of things the flag captain fills the role of, whilst also running the ship. So it's a different scenario to what you have ashore. If an admiral sets up a shore staff, again, those tend to be fairly big, well-organized organizations with lots of officers in them and lots of sailors and lots of relevant specialties and personnel suddenly appear. So the idea, the traditional perception that the Royal Navy has no idea of how to run a staff until World War II or doesn't do it and this sort of thing is very wrong. They do. They have very good staff sitting back. It's one of the interesting things. You go, the Admiralty is an incredibly efficient organization for running the whole world, but also at the same time, you have the people who say that, and people say the Navy couldn't produce good staff officers. Who do you think runs the Admiralty? It's staff officers, and they have them. So the commands do work, and they do sort of work together, and they organize quite well in this period. They do a lot of diplomatic work prior to World War II, and that's the big thing. The Indian Ocean is a critical diplomatic area. Now, the question I often get is why weren't more forces based in the Indian Ocean during peacetime? Simply put, you have them in the Mediterranean because then they can go both ways. If you put them in the Indian Ocean, that is Britain raising the stakes against Japan, quite obviously. They're in the Indian Ocean, that is a big, we're basing a major force here. Again, the idea going through, why didn't you base a larger force on Singapore? Because again, that's raising the stakes. That's not deterrence. That's threatening. And that's always the balance you have to strike when you're putting in a force for deterrence. What is enough of a threat that it deters conflict, but not so much threat that it makes it a natural occurrence. It makes it inevitable. Well, the thing is, you have to have enough force forward to act as both a tripwire and a deterrent and a presence, but you have to maintain enough force back that you can deploy it there when you need to. Plus, with the facilities available, and considering the rise of the Italian state in the Mediterranean, which is astride a key transit route for British trade, having enough of a fleet there that you could take out the Italian navy if you needed to, well, Reggio Marino was probably sensible. Then you had the home fleet as well, and so back home, defend the home and keep an eye on the things in the North Atlantic, Mediterranean fleet, also down there in the Mediterranean, they can surge quickly that way, so that's a good thing. And in the ocean, what do you have? You have town-class cruisers. Now, they're pottling around, and just consider, this ship has both Royal Marines and Army troops. Okay? HMS Manchester is sailing around doing these jobs, and she has a detachment of the Northamptonshire Regiment aboard her, reinforcing the Royal Marines she's already carrying. Why have both sets? Well, because she is the Imperial British Empire as far as the Indian Ocean is concerned. They do not have garrisons out on these islands. They do not have a major presence out on them in peacetime. This is Britain showing up and being mighty and having enough infantry, enough troops on to make sure if anything does happen that requires a ground-based policing effort is critical. Why do you have the town-class cruisers though? Well, A, the Japanese are smart enough and understand enough about ship design that they do understand what this is. Honestly, it's a anti-surface radar cruiser, not a surface radar cruiser is. And whilst there is one, HMS Birmingham, deployed to the China station to go forward and see the Japanese, and of course has fun at Seaton and other incidents with the Japanese Navy, this itself, by having these three sitting in the ocean, represents quite a big deterrent. Because the Japanese can, if they need to, focus in on the forces in the China station. They can work out where they are and they can try to overwhelm them in harbour. But to get to the ones in the Indian Ocean, they have to get past Singapore. That is not going to be quick or easy. Those forces, to come out from the Indian Ocean and start doing surface raiding, have to get past Singapore as well, but that's under British control. So pretty much, this is part of your rapid reaction force to reinforce Singapore in the event of it going suddenly warry with Japan in the late 1930s. And this is what's quite impressive is the Royal Navy is maintaining this amount of force in the Indian Ocean, even though they're dealing with the Spanish Civil War, all the conflicts rising in Europe at that time, and all the issues going on in the world. There's been a lot of events happening which have been drawing forces inexorably home because of conflicts and issues. Yet Britain has seen important enough for deterrence, for security of the empire, for security of interests and dominions and all these things to maintain their newest and best cruisers out in the Far East groupings. Plus, they've got HMS Enterprise there and Norfolk. Which is pretty darn cool if you consider that you've got 3 town-class cruisers, a full-size county, an Enterprise, which is the most modern-looking of the CDEs available, the post-World War One, well, World War One, post-World War One design continuation of the cruisers for the Royal Navy. You've got a very significant force sitting there. You've got firepower to call upon. And you can see the example of what they're doing. They're sailing around. They're meeting people from the Indian Medical Department. This is how Britain maintains its fearsome empire in the region. The only person ashore that's actually an official is the medical. It's the local doctor, who's also acts as the agent and all sorts of other things. There are places, don't get me wrong, where the empire was felt very, very harshly, that they did put down the full boot. But there are also places which are honestly painted red on the map and wouldn't know, probably didn't realize they were part of the British Empire. Right. Most of the idyll of the joy that is the Indian Ocean is spoilt when the Admiral Graf Spee makes her first visit. Now, leaving aside, and please note a link will appear above me, giving you a link to some of the Admiral Graf Spee's operations and overviews. She comes into the Indian Ocean and sinks the SS Africa shell. Now, Captain Dove proclaims that she was in Portuguese waters, and seeing as he was a noted for a merchant seaman and noted navigator, I'm tempted to believe him. But I'm also tempted to think that it was probably enough of a grey area that Langsdorff thought he could get away with it. And honestly, Langsdorff is doing this as a political operation, as I've been over before, not a really serious invasion. But he does stay south of the Mediterranean, south of Madagascar. Ay, caramba. I'm not restarting for that, but it's annoying. He says south of Madagascar because that is the French area. And the French, even when they're in the war, aren't that great at operating anything from Madagascar, which is actually going to deter a surface raider. You would need something decent to deter a surface raider. It would need to be something very decent. So this is the cruise of the Admiral Graf Spee, and as you can see, again, there is literally just a short hop into the Indian Ocean, but this is the beginning of the point. The Battle of the Atlantic from the very beginning spills over into the Indian Ocean. There are people who will tell you, and I have some remarks later about the Type 9 submarines getting into the battle of the getting into the Indian Ocean. Surface raiders, Type 9 submarines, eventually submarines based in Penang, are a part of the Indian Ocean campaign for the Kriegsmarine the whole way through World War II. The Indian Ocean is a theatre the whole way through World War II. It's not something which can be quickly forgotten. This is another reason why I find it so surprising that Force Z is based on Singapore. I'd have thought it was far more sensible to have it based with the R-class battleships as a concentrated force in the Indian Ocean, doing the counter-surface radar stuff and then react if needed, rather than pushing it forward and making it horribly exposed, as they did. These are not the only famous things, though, which end up in the Indian Ocean. To begin with, the Red Sea is dominated by tribals. And there is a nice little piece from my book. So, bye for a second again. Now, they had a lot of fun in the Mediterranean. They did, even despite the Italians not getting involved in the war before they went, they still managed to get distinguished service orders. They managed to beat off what were felt to be surface raiders. They managed to do all sorts of issues which were really quite important and intimidate the life out of a few Italians without fighting them. Pretty much this was what the tribal class were built for. The Royal Navy didn't have enough cruisers to be everywhere it needed to be in the world, and the Red Sea was not somewhere that they wanted anything getting in and causing trouble. So you want to keep out submarines, you want to keep out surface raiders, particularly things which look like the Graf Spee, despite the Graf Spee not being particularly brilliant design, but I'll get into the pitfalls of the Deutschland class in a bit, when I'm talking about the Admiral Scheer. You put your tribals in there. That is what they're built for. They have torpedoes, they have guns, they can take anything that comes. And they will do. How's that? Is that more smooth? Sorry, I was stopped a bit by thinking about how quickly managed to make it work. So, what happens in the Indian Ocean? Well, it's the Mediterranean extended more than it is the Battle of the Atlantic, as far as I'm concerned. Whilst there are some surface raiders, the Atlantis and the Penguin, which do a considerable amount of work in the Indian Ocean and cause a considerable amount of trouble, because again, the Royal Navy can't be strong everywhere. This is the point. If you are running masses of convoys in the Atlantic, if you're running convoys up and down the coast of Africa, if you're running convoys in the Mediterranean, where are the escorts going to come from to run the convoys in the Indian Ocean? They are running convoys, but they aren't as well secured. Oh, if I expand this just a little bit, so I'm still part of the screen, but I'm off to one side, put this here, you can see how the Royal Navy are expanding things. There's Convoy B7, which has a nice fight with 4 Italian destroyers, and that's escorted by HMS Leander, HMS Kimberley, a destroyer, and then an Egret class sloop, a Grimsby class sloop, HMS Yarra, a Hunt class minesweeper, HMS Derby, and Huntley. And they get in a fight with 4 Italian destroyers, and the Italian destroyers get beaten up, mainly by HMS Kimberley. They just get... The Italian destroyers really should have had a good go in this fight. Admittedly, there is Leander there, and frankly, she was not going to be an easy one to roll over. But please note, she's not HMZS Leander at this point. They are quite capable of, with 4 destroyers. If you'd imagine those being 4 tribals on the Malta force in Mediterranean during the war, and they'd met a convoy like that, that would have been a target-rich environment. This little force was escorting 34 merchant ships. Nope, it's the Italian which gets sunk. It's the Francesco Nulio. There you go. It's on 21st of October. Sarah class destroyer, and it's hit by a torpedo from HMS Kimberley. That's fun. They have a lot of interesting times. The Italian submarines do pretty well, but again, they get critically undermined by the refrigeration issue. Having Clonmacnoise Lake is not good, but it's the problems with forward basing. It's one of the reasons, again, why the British don't forward base beyond as much beyond the Mediterranean, because there is a limit to what you can support. Even the British, the Italian bases were at the range of their infrastructure, and despite their early successes in British Somaliland, which they do kick the British out of, British end up withdrawing them and having to go back. It's kind of like Dunkirk, and yeah, it's on the 17th of August in 1940. March 1941, they managed to return, but on the 17th of August, they're withdrawn, covered by the Navy as usual. That's what the Navy spends a large chunk of the first part of World War II doing, covering the army, getting them out of places, because the army, again, are very small forces. I think in this case, there's like 4,000 British and Commonwealth troops versus 20-odd thousand Italians. But the Italian submarines are quite successful, but they are very undermined by the infrastructure issues, because that's what's caused the chloromethane issue. And that's why the British, again, do not have masses of forces forward based in the Indian Ocean and the Far East because of supporting them. Now, the Admiral Scheer turns up, and frankly, okay, here's my main thing with these, and this is not a Drakenfennel 5-minute review, so don't worry, I'm not jumping into that one. But I'm going to say my big problem with these particular heavy cruisers, A, being called Panzer and considered pocket battleships, is they are definitely not a battleship in any way, shape, or form. Definitely not a pocket one. Certainly not a battle cruiser. They are a heavy cruiser which has an absurd armament. If instead of their 11-inch guns, they had had 8-inch guns, a couple forward and a couple aft, or maybe 2 triple turrets, okay, 8-inch guns, they would have been saved so much weight, so much displacement, so many other things. Would have been so much easier in terms of stowage of ammunition. Or they could have put so much more into their engines. They could have actually been decent ships, because honestly, they are slow. They are long-range diesel-powered surface raiders. Yes, I fully understand that. But why in the name of all things holy? In the nicest way, 11-inch guns was never a sensible fit for them. Yes, it makes them look so great on paper, and if you're going for top trumps, perhaps that's what you want. But in reality, the whole scenario is silly. I know they're replacing the German pre-dreadnoughts and these things, but still silly. No. A couple of nice trebled 8-inch gun turrets would have made their life easier. Look at how big that turret is on that hull. Look at how massive it is. It looks like it's about to make it topple over. We'll leave aside the conical structure of the mast and all these things. That is supposed to be your long-range surface radar. Where is my town class book? There it is. This is the British equivalent. Not too dissimilar in displacement, weight, and sort of size, but a whole lot better in terms of function and operation, with 12 6-inch guns. Yes, on paper, that wins. In practice, it would be facing a pack of these things, and honestly, when HMS Glasgow does get within aircraft range of this, she calls in all her mates. And for some reason, the Admiral Shear, hearing that the mates are on the way, and so she's going to be facing Hermes, aircraft carrier, small but still aircraft carrier, Glasgow, one of these, like HMS Manchester pictured earlier, Cape Town, Emerald, that's Enterprise's sister. Cape Town's a C class. Hawkins, a nice original sort of style heavy cruiser from post First World War batch. HMS Shropshire, a full 8-inch heavy cruiser, and HMS Canberra is coming her way. She decides she's going to depart because that would be a rerun of the Battle of the River Plate. But this time she'd have been facing a whole host more firepower and a whole host more of torpedoes. I do not rate her chances. And she can't run the risk of trying to dodge around them. She has to run as fast as she can away from them because she is not fast. So she gets in the ocean, she does this, that, she doesn't do much though. One of the interesting things, considering she does get into the Indian Ocean, is they don't try to send her out later. Probably sensible because the air and sea network has built up to an extent. But when they're forming the Monsoon Group of submarines in Penang later in the war, 1943 is actually when they start to form it, really. They don't consider sending out a large surface radar, but that would have been an interesting idea if the Germans had deployed a large surface radar to assist with the Japanese operations in the Indian Ocean. I could just imagine the Royal Navy's reaction to it. Admiral Somerville might have actually might have managed to get something to make up for Operation C. But pretty much 1941 is the Royal Navy neutralizing the Ranger Marina. Critical. Doing invasions of Iraq and Iran because the governments they don't trust there. I do apologize. I've written Reichsmarine there, and I've gone through this twice and not noticed that so far today. I do apologize. But in my defense, I wrote this on the same day and recording this on the same day, well, yesterday, when I wrote an article on World War One and an article on the Interwar. So this is the third name I've had for the German Navy in one day. I'm so tempted to just start calling them the German Navy, but I try to be accurate. Sorry, it's supposed to be the Kriegsmarine. And to be fair, the Grasp-Bay and Admiral, Grasp-Bay and sort of Admiral Speer and of course the Deutschland were built as originally as part of the Reichsmarine, so to an extent correct, but not at this time period and not at this point. Atlantis still having fun. In fact, Atlantis would have fun for quite a lot of the time. Cornwall would sink Penguin, which is a bit kind of cruel, but she would sink Penguin on the 8th of May. And HMS Sydney and Cormoran were both destroyed on the 19th of November this year. So, yeah, 1941 is an interesting time. Axis aircraft get involved. I'm still trying to track down which particular aircraft was it. There are some reports which suggest German, and most suggest Italian. But I want to know the actual type of aircraft it was. And that's what I'm tracking down for attacking The Steel Seafarer, HMS Formidable, is doing a lot of work in the Indian Ocean, which shows again the importance of this area. She's coming from the Eastern Mediterranean to come and conduct these operations on the 2nd of February, 13th of February, 21st of February, 1st of March. In fact, she seems to be spending most of a month down in the Indian Ocean in 1941. It's a shame the Royal Navy didn't have enough carriers that she couldn't hang around in the Indian Ocean for the rest of the year, because if she'd been there, then hopefully she'd have been part of Force Z. Although, again, even if they had had a carrier with them when they'd gone and done what they did, that would have still not worked. Even Formidable, it might have had a better chance. It probably would have broken up the air attacks and stopped them being able to concentrate. They might have had some cruisers with them because of part of her group, and so might have had far more defensive fire and better defensive coordination against aircraft. And if you've got a carrier providing air defense and coordinating air defense, she's probably calling up land airbase air support if that's available as well. So that might have made a big difference, but we'll never know. As it is, you have pretty much two carriers operating in the region, because you have Hermes and you have Formidable. Hermes might not be the biggest carrier, but she's better than nothing, especially for the small groups going around hunting surface raiders and retaking Italian Somaliland. But this is the trouble. This is why you have an issue, because the supreme commander or senior commander of the Army and Air Force, the joint commander of both, is having to oversee all these things and also worry about Japan. In this way, it should have been a split down the center of the Indian Ocean, with Far East Supreme Commander commanding facing off Japan, and this all being the focus of another officer. This doesn't make sense, because they've got too much on their plate, and their forces are spread far too thinly. War against Japan begins. And what do you have going on? You have a lot of stuff going on. Sparrow Force is one of the most interesting ones. I'm still not quite sure what 650 Dutch and Australian troops were supposed to be able to do in Timor against any potential invasion, but they were sent. Lieutenant Colonel Legate there, his machine gun troop next to him, and then the reinforcements below are some of the pictures. Go and look them up. There are some YouTube videos about Sparrow Force. It's a wonderful story, what they managed to achieve. On the 27th of December, a convoy WS-24 arrives at Mumbai with 20,000 troops loaded at Halifax Harbour. 20,000 troops. Unfortunately, they are pretty green. And now, above should be a link to the fall of Singapore and Malaysia videos. But seriously, looking this over, it's because of this that not much is being done now. Too many of the best troops have had to be sent out to Iran, Iraq, Somaliland. This is part of the thing. When Japan manages to strike, at this point, it's probably the worst time for them to do so, because it's denuded. The area has been denuded of their better officers. Well, when I say most of that, a large number of their better officers, a large number of their better NCOs, a large number of the more experienced units have gone because they've had to, and they are training up units in the area, but these are not the best units in terms of their readiness at the moment. They are being trained up. They're what's available. January to March 1942. Well, here's the thing. Indomitable's now in the area. Yep. Indomitable shows up and it starts taking over the carrier duties. So carriers can be made available in our part of the area when they need to be. And Indomitable will go on to be a critical part of the Indian Ocean Force and related to the British Pacific Fleet the whole way through. But she drops off 48 Hawker Hurricanes for defense of Java. But it's like 20 days later, the Darwin to Timor Allied troop convoy can't get through, and very, very much, not that much longer later than that, the IJ actually completely take Java. It's 9th of March. So the Orca Hurricanes helped them manage to hold out for what, another 44 odd days. 43, 44 days. So that's less than a day in aircraft. It's the fall of Singapore. If Singapore had been held, you would have been able to hold back quite a lot of these attacks because you'd had the infrastructure and forward basing of facilities to be able to do it and to interdict them. Singapore is the linchpin for that area of Southeast Asia. Still to this day, it's critical. If you who control Singapore controls the key to the Malacca Straits and Southeast Asia. Forget that at your peril. Congo and Haruna are having fun, and that's what people often forget. There's lots of operations going on. The Japanese are very good at having multi-level operations, and in many ways, the thing that's often forgotten about the Battle of Taranto, the attack on Taranto, is that it was British attempt to cover convoys going through and other operations, that there was an attack going on Genoa by HMS Ark Royal at the same time, that there were all sorts of operations being covered by these attacks. Operation C is another operation covering things. Operation C by the Kido Butai is providing covering Operation U and for the evasion of Christmas Island. And it's not just about the aircraft carriers and the aircraft going through. It's as much about the cruisers as it is about the aircraft carriers. And this is my main problem with the actions and the methodologies pursued by Somerville. Sorry, I forgot his name for a second there. Admiral Somerville is not at Admiral Somerville's strength. I've been over in various other points when I've been talking about him. He's had a hard war. He's been working very, very hard. He's been doing all sorts of things. He is overworked and underpaid, to borrow that rather lame expression, and he is out there. He's been put in charge. He tries to do an attack, and then when it fails, he withdraws. And because of the way he withdraws and the way he carries out things, he's reacting, not thinking. He's allowed the Japanese to achieve dominance. Reacting is how you explain the decision with Cornwall and Dorsetshire, because they were heading, well, if I remember from this way, they were heading west, away from the Kido Butai. If they continued heading west and then angled south, They would have been out of strike air range and they would have been safe. But no, he wants them to him immediately. He needs them to him now. It's almost sort of fear dictating it. So he's calling them south to him as fast as he can. And yes, people say, okay, he was making a judge based on the information he had available. It's standard practice. They should have been heading that way. It's like when you're dealing with Hermes and her group. Why? You know, they should have been heading at very best north east as north no, northwest as fast as they could. That's if they have to leave up. If yes, it's better to have your ship out of harbour, and as recent experience with the Bonhomme Richard, etc., shows, in harbour is very risky for firing. But if your ship is not going to be able to run them out, what you do is you offload the ammunition as quickly as you can. You bolt everything down, lock up all the compartments, and you get everyone off the ship. And the Japanese are welcome to come and attack it, but the odds are they won't cause that much damage to it, especially if it's positioned in the right position in the harbour so it doesn't sink in that much deeper water. And you can probably get it out and keep it going again. Or you take it northwest and get it as far away from there as possible. You've had problems with it, yes, so you haven't done it, but you don't dither around on these issues. He was making the best decisions he could in the circumstance, but the British hadn't sent out their best person available. They hadn't sent out their best person available really to run Force Z. You can understand why they've sent who they've sent, but the whole scenario in Indian Ocean is there is so much going on, and they were looking the wrong way. They were fighting the Indian Ocean, but they weren't really looking east to Japan. They were looking west to North Africa, to the Mediterranean, to the Battle Atlantic. And you can understand why, but this is another reason why I swear there needed to be a Supreme Commander appointed. Sitting in that region, able to coordinate all those things, and able to keep an eye on them. And I would have forward based them at Singapore with a reserve base back at Sri Lanka, Ceylon, as their fallback position. But here's the thing: IJN cruisers sank the liner Dardanelles as well as freighters Silksworth, Actaris. It's so many things sunk. And losing liners are critical because they are your troop movement facilities. They are key thing for moving forces around the world. And when you're fighting global war, they are really, really critical. The fact that you have submarines involved at the moment doing things is great as well. You have Seawolf and you have Truant off taking some kills. But the thing is, if those cruisers are going north, the Kido Butai, the forces are spreading out. You have them dividing. That's the perfect time in many ways for Somerville to have launched some strikes, but no, he doesn't. Right, the I-30 and the luckiest British mine of the war. So, this is all the stuff which the sort of the I-30 has managed to return with from Germany. Well, technically from France, but it's brought home lots of German goodies. It took out to Germany a lot of stuff. 2 tons of raw materials, which were critical, and more importantly, the blueprints for the Type 91 aerial torpedo, and returned all this stuff, and was returning quite happily. Now, the thing is, you'll often hear people go, oh, this nation weren't as good technologically as this nation. It's rarely that simple. Usually nations have made technological bets. And so they are strong in some areas and weaker in other areas, because you'd never have enough researchers, enough research funding to focus on all the areas simultaneously. So they take bets. Alliances are a good way of hedging your bets because in areas where you are strong, your allies might be weak, and where your allies are strong, you might be weak. And this is what's going on here. The critical thing is the air defense stuff, the radars, but more importantly, the 20mm AA guns. All those are critical. What I will never understand is why some examples of the AA guns and the blueprints, or at least copies of the blueprints, were not offloaded onto an aircraft at Penang and flown to the home islands. I'd have thought it would be a good method of starting off your production, starting off evaluating these designs before they actually reach you, so you could start preparing for them. And secondly, it would have made it a lot easier and safer should something befall your lovely submarine loaded with all your goodies. Like what happens? The British had laid lots of mines for the defence of Singapore. She runs into one. Ten Enigma coding machines survived because they'd been nicked by an admiral at Penang. Sensible gentleman, and good for him, good for his own unit. And made sense for setting up the Monsoon Group later. But just imagine the Japanese Navy with decent 20mm AA gun designs to churn out for their ships. Admittedly, they'd have had to deal with the tooling, but with all the blueprints and examples, they could have probably done that quite quickly, or relatively quickly, and by 1944, after all, she'd have got there in 1942, by 1944 they could have been fielding far better AA guns, far better anti-tank guns, rocket and glider bombs. Again, think about that from the air defense perspective of the fleets. If they had been fielding rocket and glider bombs, then they might not have needed to launch the kamikazes. They would have had their own kamikazes, but they wouldn't have needed to fly them, in which case their aircraft could have stayed out of flak range, even perhaps Dido flak, and the 5.25 flak range. Well, no, I have to say, no, that's just slightly longer. And then the American 5-inch flak range. The threat to invasion forces, the damage that could have been done, is increased greatly. Industrial diamonds, also very, very important for some of the electronics work needed to be done. Radar. It's all incredibly useful stuff, and it gets lost. One of the most important events in the Indian Ocean. So in 1943, what is it like? 1942 to 43. It is an anti-submarine warfare, it's an air war, it's a commerce war. That is an Italian submarine which serves the Italians, the Germans, and the Japanese, I think, from the story, from what I was reading. Still not quite 100% sure how it does it, but it's pretty cool. Kriegsmarine established a submarine base at Penang in occupied Malaysia. It's called Monsoon Group. They make about 40 odd attempts to get submarines, etc. out there, and they don't usually have a huge group of submarines operating out there, but they are very darn successful, the ones which do. Several of them become very, very successful. But it does mean that the Japanese and Germans have to operate on a very careful anti-submarine warfare policy, and a policy where they are not allowed to take out submarines if they're a submarine, just in case that they are actually going to take out a fellow Allied submarine, which gives the Allies a little bit of an advantage. And you also have the 10th Air Force. I am never going to be the biggest fan of Lord Louis Mountbatten, but one of the most sensible things he does is he puts a very experienced American Air Force General, well, Army Air Corps General, in charge of coordinating the air power because he finds the RAF Air Chief Marshal out there not exactly first class in his opinion. And I have to agree with him that he wasn't really doing the coordination job he should have been doing. He hadn't seemed to quite got over the perspective that he's actually fighting a decent military, whereas thankfully the commander of the 10th Air Force really had, and bombers were a critical part of the war, because unlike the facilities back in Europe, where you have these huge, great big concrete submarine pens being built, they don't really have the same level of facilities being built out there in Southeast Asia. Mainly because they've got insane distances to cover, so bombers can rarely carry as heavy bomb loads, and the theory is they can be more dispersed. And it's also getting the resources out there to build them. But, it happens. It's interesting that all the stuff that's going on in the ocean. So what have we got today? We have the Patreon video, CIA, the Royal Navy operations in the Indian Ocean from 1941 to 43. We're going to be discussing this later, what the Royal Navy was getting up to. Lots of weird things. 23rd of July from the sea, Korea in the Indonesian confrontation. 20th of July, making Mare Nostrum a hollow jest. 30th of July, pre-tribals. Ooh, all fun. So we got the Battle of Cape Passaro and HMS Emerald and HMS Enterprise. That's going to be ones which I'm looking forward to. Those are ones I'm really going to be looking forward to because they're cool. They are really, really cool. But yeah, little ships, little boat wars. That's why I've increased my collection of little ship books. I'm trying to spot my other little ship book. I have no idea where I put it, but I've managed to lose my little ship book already today. Is it behind me? No. Ah, there it is. There you go. It's cool. There's lots of cool stuff going on. And then we have Daniel Ruins. What if the Singsal incident goes hot? Interesting scenario. I'm working on about 3 scenarios at the moment. One is the scenario where no one else comes to the aid of Britain, and Britain ends up fighting Japan solo. And what happens in terms of what else would be going on? Would the British get involved in what's going on in Europe, or would they avoid it? So would they not be supporting France versus Germany? So would France actually do anything versus Germany while Germany gobbles up Eastern Europe? Possibly not. Could be interesting. Another scenario where the Americans and the French and the Dutch, and of course the Commonwealth, it always involves the Commonwealth side of the British, form up and basically take on Japan as a group against their rampant aggression, which is kind of an interesting one. It's sort of, I mentally call that one Democracies Are Us. And then the third one is this rather interesting scenario. Russia's already fighting, Soviet Russia is already fighting Japan. And so they could well decide that they're going to come to Britain's aid as well. And you have a sort of League of Nations scenario come up under a British leadership where Germany and Italy also pile in because it's a chance to look big on the world stage, because Japan has upset the League of Nations, because it allows German Navy to send out its big ships and look powerful on the world stage, and the Italians to look powerful on the world stage, and Hitler and Mussolini to plant around, and Stalin to look powerful by sending his army, and the Americans and everyone forms a sort of grand alliance versus Japan. And that's really kind of an interesting story long term. Long term, I think you have the war with Japan probably lasts about a couple of years at that point still. Because Japan would be going, oh, we've got everyone coming in us. But I don't think they would surrender quickly, although I have a feeling they would probably not win a sea battle when they are facing the combined might of the Royal Navy and the US Navy combined together, with even with all the additions added on. In fact, with the additions added on, it makes it even more less likely they're going to win. But what does interesting is all the technologies and all the perceptions that are going to change in terms of the fleets when they see are operating together. How does that affect their perspective on battleships? How does that affect their perspective on submarines, on cruisers, on communication systems? What kind of technology sharing has to go on for them to work as an alliance and as a grand alliance? How does this accelerate factors? How does this change factors? Does it make the Italians and the Germans go for aircraft carriers? What does it change with the relations with Soviet Russia? It's all sort of potentially quite interesting. So, going to be looking at that one. And Convoy War in the Perfect Storm, PQ-17. That could also taken place in the Indian Ocean. It really could have. And Mediterranean gunboat diplomacy in the Victorian era. What happens when the diplomatic service and the navy don't quite work well together, work correctly together, and it doesn't quite work? When they try to be bad cop and worse cop rather than the good cop and bad cop, which is interesting enough. What I would argue the Chinese wolf diplomacy is also creating a scenario where you have the diplomats trying to be bad cop, so it's going to force the People's Liberation Navy, People's Liberation Army, and all these things, the plan, the army, the PLA, the PLA, all their forces. Well, their armed forces, they don't want to be the good cop. So if you've got the ambassadors trying to be the bad cop, then the armed forces are going to want to be the worst cop, because they're supposed to be the ones who are intimidating you. These are the ones who are supposed to be cajoling you and being friendly and making you want to be their friend. These are the ones who are supposed to be threatening you. It's an interesting scenario going on there. Anyway, so Twitter. There's me, Patreon, me, and Global Maritime History. So thank you for all the shares and the likes. Thank you for all the subscribers and the viewers. Thank you to all the people who are pre-ordering my book, and thank you most of all to the people who are my patrons. Really, all of you are making my summer actually viable from a financial perspective, because of course, due to all the shielding, I'm not going out doing my teaching I normally do. But most of all, thanks to the patrons, I'm able to keep up my book habit, which is critical for an early career researcher at my age range, because this is the point where the productivity, the research I'm putting out of these things are critical if I want to get a permanent post in academia, if I want to make a career of it and actually be able to settle down, have a family, support all those things from something I love doing, rather than, I don't know, having to give up and do something else. Which would be really kind of annoying after putting so much effort into it all these years. Ay, caramba. That's what you have to do, but it's not what I want to do. After 15 years of putting into it, I think I'm fairly good at it, and I want to actually make it work. And thanks to all of you, I'm managing to. Still, even in lockdown with all these scenarios, I'm still managing to make it work. Just about. Thanks to your generosity and your kindness. So thank you, everyone. And take care. Take care. Thank you.